Today, the BMW company is obviously very well known the world over, and the Frazer Nash name is almost entirely forgotten, except amongst all the people in this room, as it turns out. But it wasn't always that way. The name Frazer Nash was very well known to all car-minded people from the early 1920s through to the end of the 1950s. It was, as most of you know, a small-scale manufacturer of expensive handmade sports cars based in West London, in Isleworth specifically, London Road. But BMW began not as a car maker, but as an aero engine and motorcycle manufacturer, based in Munich, same place as they are now, but they didn't start making cars until the 1930s. Their cars were virtually unheard of in Britain until Frazer Nash introduced them into the market in 1935. BMW was established in 1917, some say 1916, solely to build aero engines. Formed from another company, Rapp Motorworks. There's another company that's connected as well, but basically it comes out of Rapp Motorworks, which itself was established in 1913. So the badge, the well-known badge that often people say, that's based on an aero engine, that's based on a propeller going round, and that's why it looks the way it does. Apparently that's not the case. The case is they took the Rapp Motorworks badge, they took the Bavarian state flag, and they produced the BMW badge. The revolving propellers, which was used in advertising, and is where this story comes from, actually didn't appear until 1929. So that's more than 10 years after the company was established, and the badge was registered in 1917 as well. In 1917, as I said, aero engine only, and production of that didn't start till 1918, so they hardly impacted the war in Germany. Apparently it was a very, very good engine. If it had come out earlier, it would have had some impact. It could go very high, it was very strong, and it proved in the last months of the war to be a very strong engine, but luckily for us, it turned out a little too late. Then in 1990, BMW, the Versailles Treaty banned BMW from making any more aero engines, so they had to do something else, and they switched to making motors for tractors, for boats and motorcycles. And the first motorcycle they were producing engines, motors to put in other people's motorcycles. They developed their own frame and their own motorcycle in 1923. It was a 500cc, the R32. It's a very attractive looking bike, I think. But that's where the biking started from 1923. Meanwhile in England, so we've got this pretty big company making huge and very successful aero engines and lovely motorbikes. And Frazer Nash, on the other hand, started from the GN company. Two young men in their early 20s decided they wanted to make an inexpensive little car, not much more than a soapbox really, with a motorcycle engine on it. There are quite a few people here who really, really, really love GNs, so I have to be a bit careful what I say. The name comes from their names. They were, as we all know, Ron Godfrey for the G and Archie Frazer Nash for the N. So they put those initials together and they produced this car. And they were young and they were crazy and they rushed around in this motorized soapbox. Their first one they made in 1910, so they actually predate the BMW company. The chassis was rudimentary in the extreme. It began by being wooden framed, with an 1100cc, so twin engine, and belt drive, rubber belts to the back axle there. This is it with a body on it. It's still a very early one. That's a Jap engine up front, a twin Jap engine. And I believe that is Ron standing and Archie sitting. It's very early, and I don't think they quite sold a car by then. But this little thing was very, very successful, and it encouraged them to establish a company, initially a partnership, later on a company, to build GN in larger numbers. Motorized transport before the First World War was still not popular. I mean, most people didn't have much money, and the people who did have money would buy a big car. But the GN did prove popular and attractive to those who had motorcycles and wanted something with 2 seats, 4 wheels, slightly more comfortable, but equally economical. GN production had to stop during the war. The factory concentrated on making munitions, of course, and it started up again in 1919. So here's the new GN, looking a little more sophisticated. They switched to a steel chassis, apparently not necessarily as an improvement, but they thought that the public would think that was more sophisticated than a wooden chassis. Still the 2-cylinder 1100cc engines, chain drive more than belt drive now. And they did this just in time, as it turned out, because there was a post-war boom. Soldiers coming back, wanting to get into cheap motoring, much more sense of freedom after the war. And a cheap and cheerful machine like this was very popular. And this boom lasted for 3 years when, amazingly, several thousand of these machines were sold. The money that Archie and Ron made out of this enabled Archie to go motor racing, which was his love, and he was very successful. He was a very good driver. There weren't so many circuits you could go to in those days. He was very successful in hill climbs and anything that was going on at Brooklands. Here he's just won a 200-mile race. I think that was the first such race, a 200-mile race for these sorts of cars, which were known as cycle cars. And Archie won that, which was quite good for business. So all this motor racing, at which he happened to be so good, certainly helped the image of GN. It was seen as a sporting car. But the boom petered out in 1922, and Archie and Ron left the company that they had established because it was now financially ailing, so they moved on to other things. So Archie established a new company to produce a more sophisticated GN, which now had a 4-cylinder engine of 1500cc, still the chain drive transmission that they had developed with the GN, and this is the birth of the Frazer Nash car. He called it the Frazer Nash because Frazer was his grandmother's maiden name. It was one of his father's given names, and it was also one of his given names. And after his father died, his mother took the Frazer name and added it to her own, or her married name, and she went by the name of Dr. Frazer Nash. So Archie thought this was a good idea too, and he started calling himself Archie Frazer Nash instead of Archie Nash. And he named the car after that. Frazer Nash was a very sporting car again, very lightweight. It was designed to appeal to sportsmen and sportswomen. It was considerably more expensive than a GN. GNs really were quite cheap and cheerful, and as I said, sold in their thousands. The Frazer Nashes sold quite modestly, given their price. It appealed to the wealthier young sportsperson. And the top year for them, of all their years, throughout the 20s, 30s and 50s, was 1925, when cars like this, they sold 50 in one year. 4 a month, 1 a week. That was the top year. And in order to publicise the cars, Archie kept on competing in hill climbs and trials and races wherever he could, and he met with a good deal of success. In 1925, they had what was probably their most notable victory, and that's when they took a couple of cars to Boulogne. Not for the first time, I think, but anyway, they took a couple of cars, again 1500cc cars, and one was entered for Archie and one was entered for Clive Gallop, and they won the race that they were entered for, the Boulogne Grand Prix. And Archie had some problems and didn't finish so well. There he is with his funny woolen hat that he usually wore, sitting in the car back at the works after the race. By 1928, sales had dropped from that peak of 50 down to less than 20 cars. The company was one of Archie's companies, again, was in financial trouble, and unfortunately Archie was suffering temporary ill health. He was forced to give up his company. H.J. Aldington took over. H.J. Aldington had been a salesman for Archie and the Frazer Nash Car Company in 1925 when they had their boom year, and he did prove to be an ace salesman. Archie was an ace engineer, less good at sailing maybe. So HJ, through a little bit of conniving probably, ended up taking over the company when Archie was at a low ebb. Archie didn't have anything more to do with the company after that. He was a shareholder. He was on the board, I think, but he didn't go to board meetings. He continued for another 3 years competing in Austin Sevens, which, as we will find out in a moment, is a bit of a coincidence. So from 29 to 31, he raced little 750cc Austin Sevens, and he was also, from time to time, the team manager for Austin. Coincidentally, BMW was selling Austin Sevens. They were called Dixies. They took over a company which was building these Austin Sevens, which they're building under license. They were having financial trouble, and BMW took them over. They changed the name to a BMW Dixie in 1929, which is the same time that Archie was losing his company and going over to Austin. Although Dixie were having trouble for whatever reason, BMW made a good success of it. They used them in competition. It turned out to be very popular at the time. Of course, the whole world was just about to go into an economic downturn, and this little car proved very successful. It was nicely built, and they sold many thousands of them. They even competed in the Alpine Trial, and I'm sure Mark can put me right on this. I'm not sure whether they won their class. I think they won their class. I'm not sure whether they won an Alpine Cups or not. They did very well anyway. That year, the Alpine Trial started from Munich, which is where they were based, isn't it? Which is quite useful. But they did very well. These little cars lasted the whole distance, and there they are back at the works, covered in garlands. By 1934, the license with Austin had expired. So BMW had been working on their own car, which was much more advanced. And this is the sports version, the 315. It used a patented tubular lightweight chassis, where A-frame, the same as the Austin. The Austin was A-frame, but was normal channel section. But what BMW did, as you all know, was to come out with this super-duper tubular chassis, which they used for many years after that, with independent front suspension and a 6-cylinder engine. This sports version was the car that would lead to the connection between Frazer Nash and BMW. Meanwhile, our good friend H.J. Aldington, who'd taken over the Frazer Nash company, managed to keep it afloat during those difficult years of the early 30s after the stock market crash and the subsequent depression, something that Archie probably wouldn't have been able to do. But they struggled through. He continued to develop the car, keeping the unique chain drive transmission and offering a selection of more powerful engines, usually 1500cc up to a little bit more, but basically in that area, 1500 or a little more. Like Archie before him, H.J. Aldington loved to race, loved to compete, and was very, very good at it. And he encouraged his customers to do the same. And the sort of people that were likely to buy a Frazer Nash, who would stump up the cash for a Frazer Nash, would be the sporting people who like to get out there and get their cars muddy, rush up hill climbs and things like that. This competition kept the cars relevant to sportsmen, despite the fact that these were really quite old-fashioned cars. Pre-First World War technology, if you like, but still good at what they did. And Frazer Nash entered. One thing they loved doing, the owners of these cars, the private owners, wealthy private owners, they loved to go out and compete in Europe and do the Alpine Trial. In 32, 33, 34. In 32, H.J. Aldington, fabulous driver, and a chap named Gripper, Archie Gripper, they dominated their class and finished without a single penalty point. So they weren't early, no, they weren't late, they had no problems, or if they had a problem, they overcame them within the time, and they earned the ultimate award of an Alpine Cup. Well, in 1934, they came across BMW, who'd also entered with their new sporting 315, and there was a bit of a ding-dong in the 1.5 litre class, but the BMWs came out on top. Still, I think that year, HJ still won an Alpine Cup again. he should have won three years running, 32, 33, 34. But because he entered the Frazer Nash team in 33 and not as a single entry, he wasn't eligible for an Alpine Cup. But he still finished without loss of marks. And if he had managed to get the Alpine Cup, he would have got the very rare golden Alpine Cup, which Stirling Moss did in the 50s. Very few people have done. Anyway, good old HJ was very, very impressed with these cars. He realised he was selling a pretty out-of-date vehicle. So he immediately contacted the German company to see if they'd be willing to let him sell the car in Britain. BMW were aware of HJ's successes and the name of the Frazer Nash, and they probably believed that the English car company, the Frazer Nash car company, was much bigger, more substantial than it really was. But in those days, people tended to buy cars from their home countries. You didn't tend to export things, except maybe the odd Bugatti and things. So here was an opportunity for BMW to sell more cars than they would otherwise have done. So they did agree to have an agreement with Frazer Nash, which AFN was the company that made Frazer Nashes, and the original letters from BMW all show Aldington Frazer Nash instead of Archie Frazer Nash, because they believed Aldington was the name, which is a fair enough mistake. And here I think we've got more information, if you'd like to see it, of this, which has been brought along by the club, BMW Club. Thank you, Kate. Showing this 1934 agreement. They were granted, initially they were granted for 1 year the right to sell these cars in Britain and in the British Empire, exclusive in Britain, so they were the only ones allowed to sell in Britain. And then that agreement was extended later on, and it later included motorcycles. So it was also agreed that BMW, being an unknown name in Britain, and Frazer Nash at that time being a very well-known name in Britain, they should put this unique badge, Frazer Nash BMW, which really confuses people when we have shows of cars and Frazer Nash BMWs turn up. The number of people who come up and say, pretty car, but what the hell is it? Why does it say BMW? Why does it say Frazer Nash? So this is the crux of the whole presentation here today. The cars were called Frazer Nash BMWs. Whether German cars were a bit unpopular in Britain at that time or not, I don't know. It was only, what was it? It was only 20 years after the start of the First World War in 1934, and less than that since the finish of it. So putting the name Frazer Nash certainly did no harm whatsoever. Also, Frazer Nash were given an option to take out a license to build the cars themselves in Britain. That didn't really happen in the 30s, but that was there and available to them.